Institutional mergers and large-scale change initiatives are becoming an increasingly visible part of the higher education landscape. Demographic shifts, financial pressures, evolving student expectations, and technological disruption are pushing many colleges and universities to rethink long-standing structures and strategies. But mergers, consolidations, and enterprise-level transformations rarely succeed on strategy alone. They hinge on leadership alignment, cultural integration, and the ability of people across the institution to navigate uncertainty. So, in today's conversation, we'll explore how coaching can support higher education leaders during institutional mergers and other large-scale change initiatives. Hi, I'm Tim Jansa, a leadership and organizational development coach and your host for Coaching in Higher Education, the go-to podcast for coaching professionals and those interested in coaching at colleges and universities. To help us better understand the complexities of such large-scale transformations and how coaches can play a pivotal role in their success, it is a real pleasure to have Dr. Mary Churchill as my guest today. Mary is a senior higher ed leader and certified coach who now serves as professor of practice and as associate dean of strategic initiatives and community engagement at the Wheelock College of Education and Human Development at Boston University. Most importantly, though, she helped guide the closure of the original Wheelock College and the creation of Boston University's newest academic division, giving her a front row seat to one of the biggest kinds of disruptions a campus can experience. So welcome to the podcast, Mary, and thank you for taking the time to have this very timely conversation.
Thank you for inviting me. I'm happy to be here.
So, Mary, when we first met, you mentioned that you were once considered a fixer of programs and partnerships. That's kind of like how you phrased it. Yeah. At least, that was until you became a coach. Could you briefly share your journey as a higher ed leader and what changed for you when you became a coach?
Definitely. Well, it's a great question, too. I think for many years, for decades, I was brought in to build new programs, innovative work in what is seen as an innovative space on our campuses, online programs, international programs, professional master's programs, a lot of that type of work, external partnerships, industry partnerships. And so I had been promoted from assistant dean to associate provost and dean to finally the vice president for academic affairs at Wheelock. And I was brought on at Wheelock to do that type of work, but we quickly realized that we needed to do something quickly and different than build new programs, and that we didn't have the runway to do that work. And so it was a pivot to finding a partner and having a conversation around merger and closure. And that ended up being with Boston University. We sought a partner kind of in the spring, summer, and announced the potential partnership with BU in the fall. And then our last operation as a standalone institution was May 31st of that academic year. And so from that announcement in August through early June, there was really nothing to build. Right. So it was kind of holding space for everyone to process the closure and really a death of an institution and emotionally. And I felt incredibly unprepared to do that work.
It seems like nobody can really be prepared because you're taking something apart completely. There are a lot of people dependent on it. And I think let's just call it trauma or loss or grief that comes with it. It's something that I'd like to ask you in a second. But one thing that really struck me with what you just said, because your role before, to me, seems like it heightened an awareness of the overall ecosystem, of the larger context that leadership, that individual units play within the higher ed world and the tentacular nature, let's call it this way, of your institution. Would you say that that helped you to understand the magnitude and the different facets of what was happening a little bit better?
Definitely. I had experiences with the mergers and closures throughout my career. And so prior to my time at Wheelock, I had been an associate provost and dean at Salem State University, a comprehensive regional on Boston's North Shore. And there were two institutions right nearby. Marion Court had a very abrupt closure, and the governor asked us to help teach out some of the bachelor's level students. So I was familiar with that. And then we had pursued a potential merger with a private institution nearby and had done due diligence on that to see if it had been possible. And ultimately, we decided it wasn't. But I was very aware of the then current context of mergers and acquisitions and closures and knew that they were increasing. But I think that isn't necessarily helpful on the ground with individuals who've only ever been at one institution. To say, yeah, this is what's happening in higher ed right now. It's normal. Doesn't feel normal for them because this is their world is that one institution and they never expected it to close. So helped me, but didn't help me with them. How's that for an answer?
Well, I mean, you already alluded to it. I mean, there's a lot at stake for people. So, for any of our listeners who may be coaches who work at institutions that have never had to deal with this kind of stuff, could you briefly address like what's at stake for the institution and for its people when you're thinking about reorganizations at the least, but then going all the way to closures and mergers and being absorbed by another institution?
Yeah, I think that for us, one of the things that we tried to center throughout was the experience of our students and making sure that they felt whole as they transitioned into Boston University. And so I think that helped us all have a common goal, the success of our students. But I do think that in our situation, we were dealing with some staff and faculty transitioned to BU and some did not. And so that was a real challenge from that period of August through early June of knowing that the community was being divided in that way and had thought of themselves as a whole community. So there's a lot of pain. So the closure happened end of May 2018. And so we, for the first couple of years, and you realize COVID is hitting in kind of March 2020, right? For the first couple of years, we stayed on the original Wheelock campus. And so you would have an office that was inhabited by a faculty member who was retained. And then you would have a couple of empty offices where faculty members who had not been retained had resided for, 10, 20, 30 years. And a lot of their memorabilia was left up, different things on the door. And so it was really painful to walk by those empty spaces and see those on a daily basis. They were a reminder of the community that had been.
That's the word I just wrote down as well. I mean, it is a reminder, even though staying in that space I can see as providing somewhat of a continuity. But I can imagine psychologically, it might almost be easier sometimes to just have a clean break and we all move out and we move to a completely different space. So I can see, both sides of that.
And by the fall of 2021, we all were together on the main campus. We had enough room for us, and they had created new spaces, and so we were able to come together. But yes, I do think at first people were happy to stay, but as that first year progressed, it was like we need to get over to the other campus. So,
Mm-hmm.
yeah.
Well, another thing that really struck me from what you said earlier is that you said you maintained a focus on students. So I guess that also means that you try to maintain a focus on the mission because ultimately, student success and those educational outcomes are at the core of the mission of an institution. So even while all this is happening, reminding folks like, let's make sure that this transition is easiest and as smooth for our students as it could possibly be. I can imagine that might have helped a little bit, maybe take the edge off.
It did. I think, it's just human nature. It was really difficult though, right? And so even for staff and faculty who were used to centering the students, it was a year of, and you use this word and I agree, trauma. And so it's hard to think about others when you're in a trauma space. Right, to just put it bluntly. And so people who had always centered students, it was a struggle for some of them because it was difficult personally for them.
Please pardon the interruption. This is your friendly reminder that if you're enjoying today's episode, to please click like and to subscribe to the podcast. Your support is really important to us. Also, please check out the companion website, higheredcoaching.us or leadershipimagined.com/podcast. Thanks so much. And now back to the episode. Well, since we mentioned trauma, let's just look at it head on. I mean, when you and I first talked, you described these kind of program closures as small deaths. And of course, the closure of an institution as a much bigger death. So how did, let's just say, grief and loss factor in, and how did it show up in those different groups you already addressed, faculty, staff, students, alumni, perhaps? What did you observe?
There were divisions within each of those groups, right? So there were, let's start with students. There were some students who were excited to go to BU because I'm thinking specifically of someone who was in the communications area because the equipment and facilities at BU were so much more extensive. And so they got a tour of the recording studios and some were thrilled to, be able to have access to this. But then we had student athletes at Wheelock who would obviously not be able to come over as student athletes at BU, and they were devastated, and we helped them find other institutions so they could continue to be student athletes. And so I think that's just the student example, right? It felt individually, and I think that's true for staff and faculty too. And alumni. I think alumni, we had some of our strongest supporters and biggest donors were so relieved that we were going to BU because their investments over the years, it was not going to be a closure and death completely, that they would be able to support the mission going forward at another institution. So they were, for the most part, very happy to hear that we were merging with BU. And then we had alumni who were devastated by the closure and still, I think, are in pain over it. And so you see that schism kind of in different groups, right? It was not a uniform experience. It was a very individual level experience for each person.
And I can see how there's so much identity to some extent rolled into it. I mean, I know we have people graduating from college and university, and they say, well, I got my degree, I got my credentials, great, I'm going to move on with my life. But I think especially for younger folks, there's such a central and important part of their lives that they leave with part of their identity shaped. And then you address faculty and staff who've been there for decades sometimes. I mean, so much is rolled into that. Now, with alumni, what's interesting, I could also imagine that some of them might really have appreciated this because they see that the institution is willing to make changes, make some hard choices, but move the institution and the mission forward. Right. And just do what is needed, but yet continue on. So I can see both sides here.
Well, I do want to get back to what you said about program closure, because I do think that often we don't understand the depth of emotion related to a program closure. And as I talk to faculty around program closures, so much of their professional identity goes into developing a program. So if there's a program that you're closing, that the original developers are still active faculty, it is a mini death of sorts. They put so much of their identity into that. The students who have gone through the program, their identity is linked to that program. And so it's not just, oh, this program is losing money, let's close it. I mean, there is a psychological process as well. And I think sometimes we ignore that.
Yeah, you said sometimes we ignore it. And I've actually seen these things happen when leaders look at these program closures or reorganizations purely from a structural aspect.
And financial.
Exactly. And financial, yes, the financial bottom line, but don't take people into account. And that can have some truly detrimental and disastrous effects. As I've told the story in some.
We've all experienced that, right? Yeah, that's a lot more common. And I think we can be very operational and tactical and not sensitive to that is part of change. And the kind of all the things we know about change management have to come into play with
and change leadership. I mean, I definitely draw a line there. So we talked about emotion, how this kind of change is very individualized, or everybody digests it and lives through this differently. Identity, which of course, let's talk about coaching. So you pursued your coach training at Georgetown.
Yes. I realized that I did not have the skill set to support people through this transition, and started to realize that was a coaching skill set, and then sought out coach training because my ability to sit with someone's emotions rather than try to fix a problem was limited. And I am someone who, you come to me and tell me something, I'm going to recommend solutions, right? I'm not going to just hold space. And now I know to say, do you want me to recommend solutions, or do you just want to ideate with me or process with me, right? And so I did not have that awareness and ability prior to my coach training.
So then let me ask you this in retrospect. What potentially would you have done differently? What might you have recommended? How could a coaching approach have facilitated this massive transformation and maybe make it a little less painful to some of the stakeholders?
I relied heavily on my social work faculty who coached me during that time. But for instance, someone would come in and, one of my faculty members who was not going to be retained and would not transition to BU. We were running workshops on helping them find jobs. We were having employers come to campus. And so when they would come in and really just want to process with me, I would pull out, like, let's look at your CV. How do we update it? What is missing? Right. That is not what they wanted, but that was what I was offering. Right. And so I think now that I have had the training and have, coached over 500 hours, I would read their body language coming in and their face. And if I moved in this CV direction, I could read that this is not what they need right now. And so it's that awareness, I think, and that pausing and really trying to read the situation rather than trying to jump to some kind of solution.
I wanted to ask you, since so much of these kind of experiences, we mentioned trauma, we mentioned grief, all these things, of course, that screams therapy. How do you maintain that as a coach, that professional boundary between what we can and should be doing as coaches and at some point where maybe we have a client who's a leader who may need some support that goes in a little different direction?
My training, I think that was actually my undergrad major was psych, and I switched to sociology for my master's and my PhD because I did not want to be a therapist, right? And so when I started my program at Georgetown, they ask you, like, what's your biggest concern? I'm like, this, like, what if someone
Oh,
needs therapy and I've got a coach? And so they did a really good job of delineating the difference. And it's something I cover in all my exploratory conversations before I engage with someone. And I do executive coaching, so it's all around career. So I don't do life coaching. I mean, obviously that comes up. But the real difference that I was taught at Georgetown is that coaching is about now going forward, and therapy is really about now going backwards. And so it's really about your childhood and young adulthood and key experiences that clearly influence challenges you are facing in the workplace now. But if we start to get into a conversation in a coaching session that continues to focus on childhood or young adulthood, that is where I'm like, that's really not my expertise. That is where you're better served by a therapist, right? And so I open with that in the exploratory session. I say, like, look, if it's about your childhood and young adulthood and something that is a continuing issue that it presents itself, that's for you and a therapist.
yeah, that's an important reminder, I think, especially for burgeoning or less experienced coaches here.
Yeah.
It's easy to kind of veer into that. And of course, a client's past life will have an effect on where they are now, how they perceive something. They might be triggered by an experience because it reminds them of something that happened in the back. So just being aware of that and then just saying, time out, I'm sensing there's something else going on here, and then referring them to a licensed professional, I think is very
And
important.
often my clients are also have a therapist, right? So, and as you know, that's the best model. You have a therapist and you have a coach at the same time. It's
Yeah,
wonderful.
I like that. So, Mary, last time we talked, you mentioned to me that you drew on William Bridges' transitions framework
Yeah.
and also that you used extensive journaling as two tools or frameworks. Are there other models, tools, reflective practices, frameworks maybe that were most helpful to you and which you could possibly recommend for coaches and their clients going through this kind of transition?
So the Bridges book we read as a senior leadership team. So the president and his cabinet, we read that together. And that was really helpful as we were supporting our staff and faculty and students to have that process and realize that not everybody's at the same stage at the same time. And so that was incredibly helpful. The journaling, I try to journal anyway on a daily or almost daily basis. And so much was coming up for me at that time. And again, like sitting with different people's emotions all day long, right? It's just, there was a lot for me to process. And so the morning journaling practice, 3 pages, 750 words, became a really important part of my journey through that year and captured a lot of the raw emotions I was experiencing. And then we used that for a foundation for the book we wrote, When Colleges Close. My co-author was the former president, David Shard. And so that helped us, at least me, get back into the emotional space I had been in while I was going through the merger and closure.
Yeah, because I can imagine that sooner or later we all have to process the emotional aspect of all this, no matter how objective we want to be and or how much we're focused on the structural changes, on maybe how titles change, positions, new positions, the physical spaces, facilities, all these kind of things. I think sooner or later we'll just have to reckon with the fact that, wow, there's a big chapter of my professional life that is ending to some extent, or at least, changing over. So I can see how journaling can be super helpful just to get it out of your mind.
Yeah, and I think that health and wellness are really important. So I know that my president is a runner and he was running every day. I mean, I think kind of what works for you in that space, whether that's yoga, meditation, running, keeping that in your routine when you're going through these types of periods is incredibly important. And I think we often don't take care of ourselves. We just eat junk food or it's just we're not thinking about how important it is to take care of our bodies so that we can get through these types of experiences.
So physical well-being, but also then the mental and emotional well-being by finding some kind of outlet, by staying grounded, I
Yeah.
think, and trying to digest these kind of changes. So I alluded to that a little bit earlier. So when we look at this structurally, a college closes being absorbed by, a larger university, already faculty and staff wrestle so much, with titles, status, questions of, is this a lateral move? This is moving up. Is this moving down? How is my title, my rank? Is that going to change? Because so much of our identity as academics is also tied to that. What did you observe during the transition that you saw and how it affected faculty and staff? And if you had an advice for coaches, how could they best support these kind of struggles?
It was all over the place emotionally for folks. I think that first, not everyone was retained, right? So there was the sorting mechanism of who's retained and who's not, who was offered a position over at BU. And the one thing that was kept whole, everyone came over with the same salary or higher that they had had at Wheelock, which was good, right? You didn't want to mess with too many things. Right? So the fact that that was nice. And for most of our faculty, their teaching load went down because the teaching load had been high at Wheelock and it was not as high at BU. No one came over with tenure though. And so the tenured faculty were offered positions with the terms of tenure, meaning lifetime appointment, not a contract, but not tenure. And because the faculty at BU, according to the faculty handbook, are the ones that are able to vote on tenure. So our faculty were given the opportunity to go up for tenure. And I think some considered it. If they didn't get tenure, they still would have had a continuous appointment position, right? So it was a no risks except for emotional risk, but no loss of job. And so some considered it, and then eventually none of them chose it as an option. That was tough because they had worked on getting tenure, getting associate, getting fall at Wheelock. That was so much of their identity for their career. And then to have that be dismissed so quickly, I think was really, for each person, very challenging.
So there's governance issues that might have clashed there a little bit, right?
Yeah, I think president had wanted to bring them over with tenure, but the faculty handbook at BU would not allow it. And so there's intention and ability, like, yes, the faculty governance really prevented that from happening.
And I think that's something that coaches who are not that familiar with higher ed going in are sometimes surprised by, is that some institutions have very strong shared governance systems, right, where faculty have a lot to say. And so this could really throw a wrench into the gears. Mary, to kind of zoom out a little bit, I mean, there are a lot of mergers, acquisitions. It's such business talk too, right? But mergers, acquisitions, reorganization, absorptions, however you want to call it, that are going on these days. So I think there's definitely more of a need for skilled coaches to help with these transitions. What is like one practice, one starting point, one particular skill that you would recommend that coaches should bring to the table and have in their toolkit when they go into an environment like that?
So this is something I use with a lot of my clients, regardless of but really, what's your why? Like, what's your purpose? What impact are
Mhm.
you trying to have in the world? And so to try to center them on that, and then obviously, when they reveal that title means a lot to them, like what's going on for you and what else in your life can help you achieve that satisfaction or that goal, right? And so getting them to start to identify why are you doing this at all? Why are you in higher ed? And I think for our research active faculty that came over, eventually they realized the support for research and the recognition was so much greater at BU. And I think for them, it became a space to thrive. They didn't realize it right away, but BU just had so much more money than Wheelock, right? And so that support was very different from what they had experienced at Wheelock.
I always like to close with learning. When you look back at the last, I think it was like 8 years ago now, something like that, right? Eight,
Yeah.
9 years. How have you changed as a professional and now as a professional certified executive coach in terms of the way you look at higher ed organizations, their needs, their people, especially in light of such a huge, almost traumatic experience like dissolving Wheelock and integrating it into BU?
Yeah. Well, I mean, we didn't talk much about building the new college, which was a different
Mm,
set of challenges, right?
yeah.
Because you're taking taking a unit from BU and a unit from Wheelock and building something new and trying to present them to one another as equals. And so that took a bit. That's a different conversation. But so I think the learning is something that has come up again and again in this conversation, which is you have to meet each individual on their own terms, right? And so that journey for each person is going to be very, very different. So to assume that you can say one thing that's going to work for everyone or do one thing, we had a lot of open forums. And those were spaces for individual faculty, staff, sometimes students to come just process with a group of leaders. And we learned a lot. And each conversation was different. And so what this was like for each person was just really different depending on their life circumstances and their own dispositional challenges it was very different. And so to not assume that everyone's going through the same thing, I think is really, really important.
Yeah, change is hard and change is super personal. And I think as will have become obvious to anybody watching and listening to our conversation, you can't take out the human aspect of this as much as some of our leaders are prone to doing. So I think this is also where coaching comes in because we are able to account for that and work with people eye to eye and partner up with them at that level.
And I do think the larger the organization, the more challenging it can be. It wasn't like that at BU because we were building this new college, but there were some faculty who went into larger units that were not part of building this new college. And I think for them, it may have been a more challenging experience.
Mary, this has been a super insightful conversation. I really appreciate you sharing your experience and your expertise, especially from the vantage point of a certified coach. There's just so much going on. This is such a dynamic environment. And I think, just having you as a resource for our audience has been just wonderful. So thank you so much for making time.
Thanks for having this conversation with me. This was great.
And to my audience, thank you so much for spending a little bit of time with us again today. Starting with the next episode, we're going to be slowly wrapping up season 2. We're going to be doing things slightly differently because I'm going to be bringing in some coaches and their clients, including my own. So be on the lookout for the announcement of those episodes. For now, as always, if you're interested in some more information about this episode, about my guest, Dr. Mary Churchill, about the topic we just discussed, and some additional resources, please go to the companion site, which is higheredcoaching.us or leadershipimagined.com/podcast. We'll see you soon. And until then, please keep making a difference, one client and one conversation at a time. Take care.